Hi, I am Mandy Davis, the Director of Trauma Informed Oregon, which is housed at Portland State University School of Social Work. This is a presentation. My disclaimer for this conversation presentation recording is that this is not in replace of a formal training. It is not a complete training about trauma-informed care. In fact, I pretty minimally am going to talk about it. This was in response to some folks around the state who were needing information about dealing with COVID impact and response and actually having to reopen programming. And so this was an attempt to provide some kind of things to think about, some techniques, some skills, but also more globally just how to think about all of this as we move forward in doing this work. So take it, hopefully you'll find some information that's helpful, and just know that it's certainly not complete. So what I'll do is I'm going to quickly just talk about trauma-informed care a little bit, really more of the framework. If trauma-informed care is very new to you, it'll just kind of give you a little bit of grounding and why we talk about the things we talk about, and then talk about the impact of toxic stress, which we're experiencing in response to COVID, as well as other things, and how we can think about that for ourselves as staff and providers, and then also the impact on those around us, and a little bit about application. So I'm going to not spend much time here because I'm recording this, but when I do this live with groups, on Zoom with groups, I do just want to remind you so that you can also use this, that in our work at Trauma Informed Care, we talk about having trauma-informed meetings, right? So as we gather together, what can we put in place? And this, this picture you're seeing to the left is actually, you can download it from our website. It's actually how to host a meeting that was in-person meetings. We also, and I'll, on our website now, have a how to host virtual meetings from a trauma-informed standpoint. So it's things like, asking people to make sure that they have their space in a way that's best for them. Do they have access to water? Inviting people to turn their cameras on or off or put them sideways, right? So just be thinking about how you host virtual meetings if you're needing to do a lot of those, and the fatigue of Zoom and all of the things as we go through this. Because trauma-informed care, of course, is about how we do work. And so we want to make sure we start off with all of those things. So this slide just talks about a few things I want us to consider as we are working on COVID-19 response and efforts and re-engaging populations. The first is making sure that though we know COVID-19 is impacting all of us, that we are making sure to honor that is not impacting all of us the same way. So things such as race and class and gender, region, language, culture, all of those things are going to have those experiences be different, and that as we re-engage with populations, that we find ways to honor those differences. I also want to say that I think that what's happening right now is that there's simultaneously acute traumatic stress or acute stress happening right here in the moment, as well as accumulated, right? So experiencing stress prior to COVID-19, populations who are already struggling, and weren't having access to needed services. Now that's even more so, as well as prolonged stress. So acute, and then stress over time and the impact of that, and then accumulated. So things to think about, because those are somewhat different in the sense of intervention. And yet I think COVID-19 is providing a situation in which all that is happening simultaneously. So typically in a natural disaster response, we would talk about what to do in the first 48 hours, and then what to do in a month later, and 6 months later, maybe a year later. And it feels like right now COVID-19 is creating this thing where all those things are happening at once. Making sure we're allowing time for grief and for feelings. So it's not straight into the doing and how to do things differently, right? But to really understand that people are going to need to experience grief and loss. And in the trauma world, we talk a lot about the both and. So you can both be, angry at a loss, and you can both be experiencing, happiness being with your family. So honoring those things and that duality. The hierarchy of needs, right? So we know that people need to be fed, and there needs to be shelter, and those things have to be there first before we can move forward. And even in the sense of learning, like in order to learn information, new information, you have to have regulation and relationship first before you can get to the reasoning part of the brain. I want you to be thinking about what's next. Wherever you are in this COVID-19 response, what might you do next, and what can you be thinking about next? And also really taking note of learning the things that we're learning that's working better. What are the positive learnings out of COVID-19? What are the things that we've been wanting to do for years from a policy or procedure standpoint that we somehow now have been able to do? Let's keep record of those so we don't forget, and we can continue that work as we move forward. And then really important is that your wellness as providers and as supporters and caregivers is critical, and will also fluctuate. You'll have great days and not great days, and productive weeks and not productive weeks. Another piece of consideration as you work with this information is to think about it on 3 different levels. So intrapersonally, what are you needing for yourself within yourself? Interpersonally, so how are these things manifesting in your relationships with your coworkers and your families and your neighbors? And then how is this manifest in an organization? And what do we need to think about regarding policies and practices and decision making that's happening right now? So kind of a quick review of trauma-informed care is when we talk about trauma-informed care, we often talk about these 4 R's. So we talk about realizing the widespread impact, that to be trauma-informed, an organization, we want you to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand all the potential paths of recovery. There's not a one-size-fits-all. We want you to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, adversity, and toxic stress in those that you serve, but also in your staff, right? So what does this start to look like? And we want you to respond by fully integrating that knowledge about trauma and toxic stress into your policies, your procedures, and then your practices. And then we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. So that's kind of some of the beginning pieces and foundations of trauma-informed care. A couple other terms I want to throw out to you is the term trauma. There's lots of ways to define it. It's really important that you take a moment to think about that and think about how it gets defined for your community or your service sector. I often talk about it as something that overwhelms your ability to cope in the moment, right? And so one experience is traumatic for some and not traumatic for someone else. And there's some experiences that are always traumatic. Toxic stress is another phrase that I think often works better for many people. And it's about the prolonged activation of the stress response system. So when we talk about the stress response system, we're talking about, when your heart rate's up, when your breathing is distressed, right? Shoulders are like this. So if you're in that state of heightened stress over lots of time without any buffering impact, without a relationship or a caring adult or person in your life that can help you release that, right? That's called toxic stress. And toxic stress starts to and we'll talk in a minute, the things that it starts to impact in our function in our bodies. Another word that I like to use a lot is scarcity. And this is defined by these authors as having less than you think you need. So like the scarcity of time, the scarcity of clarity maybe. And so what's really important about scarcity is that these different trauma, toxic stress, and scarcity, start to look similar, and yet you'll need to find the words that work for you. And so scarcity, what I talk about is like this idea of tunnel vision that happens when we experience trauma. When we experience scarcity, is you start to focus on that thing that you don't have, and you kind of can't see out of that, and you can't see differently, and it's hard to be imaginative and innovative, which is actually what we're asking people to really do right now. So again, real quick, the science of trauma. So trauma-informed care is based on the science of neurobiology and epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and resiliency. We call it Neuroscience. And we use that science and knowledge, and because of that science and knowledge, we then promote these principles. So we ask ourselves, to what extent are we promoting physical safety for our staff and for those we serve? To what extent are we promoting emotional safety? To what extent are we promoting transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, voice and choice, and to what extent are our services and programs culturally responsive and culturally sustaining? So those are the principles of trauma-informed care we ground our work in. Now, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on the kind of neurobiology pieces of science, and very briefly, but it helps kind of frame up some of the things that we're thinking about. So the science of neurobiology is what helps us understand how our brains are developed and the functions and how they're impacted by toxic stress and trauma. So a real quick example here by Dan Siegel is the hand model of the brain. And the idea here is that this is your brain. And when we have activation, we flip our lid. So when we feel a sense of threat to ourselves, in whatever way that comes, we flip our lid. And when we flip our lid, we lose kind of the access to the functions of the prefrontal cortex. And those functions are things like our memory, our attention, our thinking brain, et cetera. And this is important because what we're going to be talking about is like what you're going to start to think about is to what extent are you, are your staff, are your families kind of lids flipped, and then what are we asking them to do that may not be available to them in that moment. So if you look here, it even says at this point, when we flip our lid, right, due to triggers and threats, our emotions are overriding our ability to think clearly. So just start to think about that. Like, what are some of the emotions you might be seeing from yourself and from your staff and from those you serve? When we talk about those functions that often get impaired, is a couple things, and I'm going to go through them again too quickly. But one is our attention. So like right now, the reason I'm kind of doing this relatively quickly is I know that a lot of people just can't hold their attention for very long right now, right? You may have 20 minutes that you can kind of hang on to, especially learning new information. So thinking about how attention can be impacted, and think about this for yourself. If you're a reader, are you having a hard time reading? Like is it taking you longer to read 4 or 5 pages than it would have before this stress was happening? A couple other things, your amygdala is hypervigilant. It's always scanning for threat. That's its job. And so what this means is oftentimes when people are activated or experiencing toxic stress, sensory input is heightened. So lights are brighter, sounds feel bigger, touch feels different. So you want to pay attention to your environment. When it comes to actually, kind of attending and having attention, what you tend to be good at in times of heightened stress is attending to lots of things happening around you, but not to one thing in front of you. So you'll be aware of kind of a little bit about a lot of things, but you won't be able to focus intently. So if you're asking people to focus, your staff, your families, or et cetera, you need to think about how long people can focus for, how to offer breaks. You might need to follow up with information in an email because people won't have remembered all of that, which like leads into the next function that's often impaired, which is memory. So when we're in these times of toxic stress, our memory is impaired. And you may find this is happening to you already. Are you making a lot more lists? Are you like, wait a minute, I thought I just, right? So paying attention to how you can support yourself in that time, right? And again, support others around you. Communication is impaired at this time, and this is a really big one because it's often the one that causes a lot of extra stress on top of things. So what we have in times of stress, or when we're activated, what I mean by activated, your stress response system is activated, is that we have decreased verbal and we have increased nonverbal. So that means that like listening to words and language is less likely, but people are really heightenedly aware of nonverbals. So this is really interesting to think about as we do all this this virtual work, right? Because you may be actually paying attention to my nonverbals more than you're paying attention to my words. But we're also in this one-dimensional way of your ability to interpret that correctly. And because we don't have relationship, that might fall in a different way. So pay attention to that. Like one of the things I've been saying to people in meetings is if anything I say, or if you're wondering about a look I had, by all means, just email me and ask me, because I just am less able to know how you might be interpreting, especially my nonverbals in a virtual platform. And then executive functioning is impaired. And this is your decision-making, your planning, your budgeting, your forward thinking. All of that is really challenged right now. It doesn't mean you can't do it, especially if you're a leader or a supervisor. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it means it's more exhausting. And I don't know if I know I've experienced this. I'm like, yeah, I know I need to think about 6 months from now, but that feels really big and exhausting. So pay attention to that. Okay, so just to hone in on communication, some of the reminders that I think help. So one thing is the source matters, right? So who is giving the message makes a difference. Do those who receive the message trust that person, right? So if you're going to go out and tell people they need to wear a mask, who's giving that information, and how can that information, and who can you ask to do that? So it might be you, it might be other folks in your organization or in your community who can speak out about that. For instance, if you're a new manager of a group, you're going to probably be struggling more right now because there's not the trust and relationship built for you to be in a time when you're trying to manage stress. Consistency of messages across messengers, right? Like staff don't need to hear 4 different things from 4 different people. So making sure that and those that you're serving, like you can have one person that says you need to wear a mask and one person says you don't, right? So consistency of message. Having clear and direct information. When we're in times of toxic stress, we just aren't in a space to muddle through what I call gray area information. So things like whatever you feel like, it depends, what feels safe to you. Those are really big things that people have to sort through in this particular time. So you want more direct, like this is how we're going to manage this. This is what we're going to ask of you. By all means ask questions, but don't set people up for like trying to figure things out too much. And then make sure in communication you have multiple methods. So it's not just talking to people, it's putting things on sandwich boards, it's having pictures of things, it's having lots of different methods and lots of repetition in the messages we're trying to get across. If you hold meetings, you want to have more frequent with less duration meetings, right? So instead of having a 2-hour meeting, you might break it up in 30-minute chunks as you think about doing that. Have a communication plan, right? Who's communicating what, where, when, and how. And then just as a, the other thing I would tell you to do is think about having spotters. So I really try not to send any email out or communication out until another one of my peer and staff have looked at that. Right? Because again, what you think sounds really great might land in a really different way. So have other people read your information. This is on our website, so I'm not going to go through it, but it's called The Anatomy of a Trauma-Informed Script. So it actually talks about how to write scripts or communications through a trauma-informed lens. So do take a moment to check that out. Expectations, just in general, some things to think about. We're not as productive at this time. Things are taking longer, right? Help people focus with short-term goals and be really clear with what's expected in those times. Help folks prioritize, because right now that can be really hard and we can't do it all in the same way. So help folks prioritize what they need to do. And then flexible schedules, right? Support the team, you're trying to support the team while supporting individual needs. So pay attention to expectations, especially in this virtual world. Considerations for organizations. Again, this is a resource on our website, so I won't go through it, but I do encourage you, especially if you're in a position of making lots of decisions. These are how to use those trauma-informed care principles to make decisions about how organizations can be functioning right now. So it's helping you think about what's mostly needed and what policies and procedures you might want to enact or think about whether you have. And this is trying to respond to the fact that most people are going to be more in black and white thinking. They're going to want more yes or no's. Attention is going to be narrow, right? You're going to have difficulty planning and thinking ahead. You might have a hard time regulating emotions these days differently than before this started happening. And it'll be harder to make decisions. So knowing that, then what can you do forward? So a couple of the primary things in that document we're asking you to think about is really what are the things you can do from an organizational standpoint to support regulation, right? So modeling the calm behavior you want staff really starts with you, but then are there any things you can do in the policy procedure work you do to support regulation, to prioritize relationship. And the reason relationship is so critical, it has to be a caring, buffering relationship, is that relationships actually buffer, mitigate stress. So if you're experiencing stress, a caring relationship that offers you the ability, again, to decrease that heightened sense. And when I say caring relationship, I don't necessarily, a family member, but a supervisor, a peer who can help you be in a moment where you get to release some of that is what helps and is like the best intervention we have. And then explaining the why behind decisions as you're making decisions. This is why we're doing it is always important. Health staff and those you serve know what to expect to the extent possible. These are uncertain times, and the more we can let people know what's coming, the better the better it is for everybody. And then reframing behaviors, right? We're all trying to figure this out, and so having stopping and giving people grace and saying, I wonder if, right, what may be behind that behavior differently. This is a graph from Bruce Perry's Neurosequential Model work, and I only bring it up right now just to kind of reiterate this idea that we need to relate, regulate, and then reason. So we're working from the brainstem upwards, and so in order to get to the reasoning, abstract thoughts, and think about if you're a school or working with youth, a lot of times schools are they're going after academics, but in order to get to any kind of academic learning, you have to start with relating and regulating. So just another really important point as you decide what you want to focus on during your days or your programs. I want to talk for a minute about these 7, what Bessel van der Kolk calls the preconditions of trauma and toxic stress. And I really have used this with myself and with staff and with others about taking care of providers. And absolutely, you could think about how to use it with families and those you serve. But as I say each one, I really want you to think about the why and how of these things so that you can modify them as you move forward. So number 1, he reminds us that safety is important, right? It's like those Maslow hierarchy of needs. If people don't feel safe, you can only get so far, right? And so knowing that a lot of times safety is around fight, flight, or freeze when we don't feel safe, and recognizing that right now, a lot of people don't have the use of flight. And so we're very, a lot of us in the violence prevention world are very worried about this, right? So be thinking about whether people feel safe. And then how, and as you re-engage, it's gonna be really important. Do people feel safe? Do they trust you that you're gonna care for them, right? And take care of the things that you have to take care of to decrease the transmission of COVID. Number two is have a predictable environment. Now, this is really important because I want you to know why predictable environments are important. Because when my kids' school shut down and you started hearing a lot of people say, you can keep the same schedule. It wasn't about keeping the same schedule to mirror school or for the academic needs of that schedule, but the predictable schedule, whatever that is, if it's like the school or just one you create, is important because right now so many of us are extending so much energy trying to kind of predict the unknown, like we're kind of waiting for like what's the new thing or what's the new information or what information can I believe, that we're exhausted with the unknown, that anything we can then limit, anything that we can rely on that isn't an unknown is gonna help. And so whether it's eating the same thing for breakfast or at the same time of day, like whatever you can predict and control, the more of that you can add into your life, the better. Number three, connect with others and self. So again, we've heard a lot of this today. It's Trauma from Oregon very quickly started talking about, right? Social connection while physical distancing, because we know the power of the social connection. So we've talked a lot about, you've heard probably people talk about this, but again, it's not just because it sounds like a good thing to say, it's because it buffers the impact of stress. So as you were thinking about ways you connect to others and engaging in that work, also think about, taking time to connect with yourself. So different folks, different, we all need different amounts of time and quiet time, and then with others. So moderate that. Staying present. When we experience toxic stress and trauma, it's a pretty common coping skill to numb out, to check out. And it's an effective coping skill. So we don't take that away, but you just want to monitor how able you are to stay present, and maybe when are the times you really need to be present and how well are you doing with that. So, taking moments just to orient yourself to where you are, what day it is, those type of things. Number 5, he talks about ways to take action to reduce immobility. So this is actually, this is about movement and in some different ways. So as we experience toxic stress, the stress hormones are within our body, and we have to find ways to release that. And any way your body will let you move is a way to do that. It could be having, a Zoom dance party. It could be listening to music and singing out loud. It also can be, and this is important to note, can be the taking care of. So taking care of an animal, taking care of a plant, all of those things kind of help us shift those stress hormones out of our system. Number 6 was sense of time and sequence. And this is about when we experience trauma and toxic stress, we feel like it's never going to end. And so finding ways, asking your staff, your families, of like, what are some ways that time is moving? We cannot guarantee that things are going to get better, but we can guarantee things are going to change. And so taking a moment to say, I notice that the leaves are changing or that the weather's changing, kind of what day is it? What month is it? So really keeping that what is the time, and then is noting that time is moving forward. And then finally, finding purpose, right? What is the purpose? What is your purpose in this time? What is your program's purpose in this time? And what is your organization's purpose in this time? As a way to kind of, we call, that's related to post-trauma growth and related to resilience. So as you think about those things, you'll be thinking about, to the extent that you are doing these things and how much they're helping you. Qualities of resilience, I'm just pulling out, as part of the neurobiology, epigenetics, adverse childhood experience, and resiliency, because I think you'll see those qualities of resilience popping up in those things we just talked about. So finding ways to provide service to others, opportunities for self-efficacy, opportunities for self-reflection, and so having that time, and then opportunities to connect to others. And that these are the things that are going to help us, again, mitigate, prevent, manage toxic stress. So I'm going to move straight into application. And when I say this, like, I don't know who is seeing this right now. So this is not a prescription, like don't go do these things, but just kind of think about these things and see how they apply to your work as we go through. This was particularly, I prepared this specifically for folks who are opening summer youth programming. So that's the way it's set up. So for instance, before folks are arriving into new program, before you are re-engaging as you are opening services up, you want to think about some things, right? When I think about the principles, I'm thinking about prediction, transparency, and safety. So how are you preparing for physical health? And this is like, do your staff feel good about the procedures that are in place? Do they know what they are? Are they compliant? How are you going to hold people compliant with that, right? Are you going to have certain people help monitor that are trusted by the community? Make sure you prepare staff with information they need, and then hear their worries prior to coming in, right? So what are they worried about? And then what can you put in place about that? If you're working with families and you specifically, right, communicating with parents and caregivers about new protocols, how they can ask questions, what concerns they might have, predict as many possible issues as you can. So depending on age, right, drop-offs if may be really different, right? Because you might be like the beginning of school drop-off. You might have children who are really who are more attached and clingy because they've been with their parents for a really long time right now. You may have some parents who are like ready to drop off their kids and leave, and you might have to actually engage them in a little bit more kind of um, the short goodbye, long hello kind of method of drop off for programming. So just think about how you think about anything you can predict for parents. Like you might say to parents, we might have to call you and have you come be with that child differently than before because of how they're experiencing that. During a service day or a program, you're thinking about regulation, relationship, and that's going to help. And what's going to help that is predictability, consistency, and peer support. So a couple of things to think about again. Be front and center and prepared to guide people. So let's say you literally are youth program, people are dropping off, you're coming with their children and leaving them with you for part of the day. You know, have that first couple times, have somebody out there doing some really great customer service, right? Don't leave things up for parents and youth to try to figure out, like, am I supposed to get out of my car? Am I not supposed to get out of my car? Do I need to wear a mask? Do I not need to wear a mask? All of that needs to be really clear in a repetition and done in a really welcoming way, right? So find the person that has that quality. I was at a grocery store the other day and there was somebody who stood out there and was just constantly was like, hi, everybody. So just remember, and it wasn't threatening. It was easy to understand. And even though I've been there multiple times, it was fine to listen to again. Have words for non-stigmatizing correction of protocols. That's a big way of saying, like, what I've been thinking about is that I think we have some pretty big expectations of folks that I don't know how fair it is, you know, to not think young children are going to want to touch each other and be close and those type of things. And so be prepared for how you're going to guide that behavior differently, right? So that you don't end up that you're already anxious because of all of this, and then you have a child who touches another child and we end up yelling at the kid. And so I'm pretty worried right now that we're going to create these scenarios where staff are feeling overburdened with all the things they have to manage, and then we're just going to have kids basically yelled at all day for not following kind of health protocols. So maybe go ahead and start thinking about, like, what are the words you could say? Maybe you come up with a fun song about washing hands, right? Maybe there's something on the wall you can point to about, like, oh, remember, and you know, maybe you show the Sesame Street video about washing hands and you can have that available. Again, all obviously dependent on the developmental age, but be ready for that. Have open and closing rituals, right, to regulate and relate. So as people come into the space, have that be predictable every time. Have a moment for people to kind of shift their feelings and emotions. And again, that's really different based on age. And then make sure at the end of the day, you have the same way of ending, checking in, checking out, soft starts. That could be like playing, it doesn't have to be quiet. It could be playing music for 5 minutes and have everybody sit in a hula hoop and talk about what the day is going to look like, and then ending with something similar. You know, have the information about safety protocols in several ways. You want to verbally explain it. You want to actually act it out, like make it fun and show, like, hey, so we can't shake hands anymore. What we're going to suggest you do is whatever, you know, like come up with the fun things that engage your population, but demonstrate it, right? Don't just say it. So say it, have a picture of it, and then try to demonstrate it. The first day you engage folks, or the first time people are engaging with you, you need to speak about COVID-19, right? The elephant in the room, we don't want that. Because then everybody's wondering and they're spending all their mental energy trying to figure out why no one's talking about this. If I had a group of youth I was coming together with, I would say, let's say I have a group of 7-year-olds. I'd sit them down and be like, hey, what do you notice different about our space right now? So let them engage with the difference. Like, there's a bunch of hand washing stations. There's new signs up around this. So you can just have them explore the space with their eyes in that way and notice those differences. You might find that there's different information out there and that people, that the youth you're working with actually don't agree on the same thing or hearing different messages, maybe about wearing masks, maybe about how far to stay away from folks. And so you need to be ready for that too. And again, have you and your staff have your phrase that you go to, right? It might be something like, there's a lot of information out there for us to hear, and people have different ideas. In this program, what we're doing to keep you and ourselves safe is we're asking for this. We're asking people to wear masks, or to wear a mask at these times, or whatever that is. But again, have that ready. Go ahead and predict that's probably going to happen, and have that ready. I was listening to one of my children's Zoom classes, and this was coming up. Different children were like, yeah, but I hear this and I hear that. So kind of be ready to help them sort that through. Incorporate regulation throughout the day. And if you don't know how to do this, right, call us or look at, find the things that work in the context of how you do your work. So rhythm, movement, meditation. Offer space for one-on-one regulation needs, right? If somebody just needs to get the wiggles out, do you have space that they can go do that? Since some of that's going to be challenging right now. All right, let's see. Coming up for the dance, we're saying hello again, just having a lot of fun with how you can engage people differently and how they can be together. And then after a day or a program or an event, think about, take a time to reflect on how it went. This is new. We don't have a playbook on this. So allow yourself the opportunity to say, well, that was really hard, or that didn't work at all, or that spacing didn't happen, right? So be gentle and assess that. Check in with your own regulation and with your staff. Like, how are you after today, right? I suspect it's going to be pretty exhausting for a while. Note any concerns you might have, and then communicate with caregivers anything you need to about the day. This worked really well. We're going to make this change, whatever that is. So throughout, kind of all the stuff we're doing, right? Just communication to all folks in lots of ways with repetition. I have no problem if someone gets annoyed with me because I've already said something to them multiple ways. I'd much rather that than they're like, you didn't tell me this. And let's, again, think about that neurobiology. A lot of times you've said it multiple ways. The person just wasn't able to hear it or retain that information. So kind of be gentle and be ready for having to repeat yourself. And then especially around youth is like behaviors of concern. So kind of be prepared to just kind of stop if we see behaviors and ask, is this developmental, right? Is this potentially stress? But it may not all be about COVID. It may be a developmental experience for that child. We expect to see a lot of regression. What we mean by that is children who were sleeping through the night are likely maybe not sleeping through the night anymore. Children who were kind of moving to eating solids, maybe not doing that anymore. Children who are beginning to walk are coming, but so that's not unusual. And you want to help parents and yourselves realize that that's pretty normal. Anytime there's significant stress in the life of young people, it's going to kind of pause development for a moment for a lot of them. As you are engaging with them, that's gonna move itself through. That children can recover easily in those developmental steps. And so we want to recognize it, normalize it, and then support the movement forward. If in fact you have concerns, then you need to take the next step and talk to the caregiver and talk to the child and those types of things. You're likely going to see a flow of behaviors. It might be that the first day is really chaotic, but the third day is fine, and the last day is really chaotic. Or it might be the opposite, right? So just be ready and be available for flexibility around that. This final thing about healing, this isn't something to go do, because you need to have thought and heart about this, and it may not be what all of you are going to need to do, but I just want to be able to throw it, kind of plant the seed for you, is that, and to also know that some youth are going to be fine. They're going to come in and be fine. They adapt well, either because they've had to adapt all their life or because they just can't. So there are lots of variables involved in how people are going to react to this. So a couple things about healing, right, is, people need to be seen and heard. And so, what feelings did you associate with your stay home, stay safe experience? You could use the what's a thorn, a rose, and a bud experience, right? A rose is something that's fabulous. A thorn is something that's not, and a bud is something you look forward to. So just finding ways to incorporate a way that those you work with and your staff can share their unique experiences. Some people staying home, they're flourishing, they're like, it's okay. Some people are baking bread, and some people are really struggling for a variety of reasons. They've lost loved ones, they've lost paychecks, right? So you want to make sure that we're able to hold all of that in the room. So feeling left behind. There are a lot of folks who are going to feel abandoned from systems and from organizations, right? Like, I feel like my kids, some people will feel like their kids were left behind because they didn't have technology, or maybe their county was left behind because they didn't have internet access. So, allowing that to be talked about without taking it personally is really important. Grief and loss, right? So loss of loved ones, loss of paychecks, loss of birthday parties, loss of all of the things, right? So again, providing space or allowing that to come into the conversation. And then post-trauma growth, again, that thing of like, what have you learned about yourself, about those around you, about your organization, about the way we do things that we want to continue forward with, right? And again, the healing stuff, if you feel like this is important, by all means be in touch. And it's really, if we think about just at least being aware of that, at the minimum, just being aware that those things are happening. And then as they pop up, that we're not stifling that, we're not stopping that process. And unless you feel uncomfortable about that. All right, I think I'm going to wrap that up. So something to be thinking about right now is, what worries do you have? What questions do you have? What ideas do you have as you kind of sit with all this information? And so kind of think about, these are lots of little seeds planted of things you might want to think about as you're doing this work, and be in touch if you have questions. And, again, look at those resources online.